I've titled this message, Lessons from the Furnace. Lessons from the Furnace. Now, just from that brief title, many of you will know exactly what biblical incident that we're going to be focusing on this morning, because some of you have heard about it from the time you were little kids in Sunday school. It's the account of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. But don't turn me off, thinking that you know all about this story. Let's be open to any new insight the Lord might have for us this morning, or maybe to any old familiar truth that He may want to remind us of and needs to remind us of that we need to apply to something that's going on in our lives right now. But first, just a quick recap of what's happening here. The account is found in the Bible in the 3rd chapter of the book of Daniel. You remember the Babylonians, they had conquered the land of Israel at this point. And as a result, many of the Jews had been removed from their homeland, forcibly taken away as captives, some to Babylon. And some of the more promising young men among the Jewish captives, they were evaluated and trained for government service. Several of those whom God blessed and who did well and rose up high in the government ranks were Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, at one point, the king, Nebuchadnezzar, he built this huge golden statue. And he gave the command that every time the royal musicians struck up a tune, everybody had to fall down and worship this image he had made. And if anyone refused to do so, he or she would be immediately thrown into the middle of a blazing, hot, fiery furnace. In other words, it was a death sentence. But one day, some of the other Babylonian officials, probably out of jealousy, they came to the king informing him that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not obeying the king's command. And there were probably some others, certainly Daniel and some others who weren't doing that too, maybe some of the other Jews. But like I say, probably out of jealousy, they were trying to get the king to look badly at these particular three that he had raised up to such high leadership positions. They told him that they weren't bowing down and worshiping this image he had made. So the king called them in. He called in those three and gave them the opportunity to prove themselves, to fall down before that image and worship it. And that's where we'll pick up to read just a few verses here to their response in Daniel chapter 3, beginning at verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. So they refused. And when they refused to obey that command, if you go on and read there, it made the king furious. He not only had them thrown in the furnace, but he had it fired up 7 times hotter than usual. It was so hot that it tells us that some of the king's own men died as they threw the 3 Jews into the blazing inferno. But you remember what happened. The 3 men didn't die in the furnace. God did protect them. He delivered them. They came out alive without even the smell of smoke on them. Now, I can't even burn a few sticks and leaves out in my yard without coming away smelling all smoky. But they came away without even the smell of smoke. So the king ended up recognizing God's hand in all of this and honoring Him and commanding that nobody else was to speak anything against their God. And then He promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, probably right the opposite from what those guys who turned them in and who told on them were hoping would happen. So this is a familiar story. So what are some lessons we can take away from this today? Well, first of all is the importance of being people of principle. People of principle. Now what does that mean? It means that we have certain foundational beliefs that dictate how we live. We believe certain things are right and wrong, and we conduct ourselves in accordance with those moral principles. Now, in contrast, an unprincipled person is liable to do anything in a given situation in order to get what he wants, or in order to try to stay out of trouble or gain power, or whatever it is that he might be looking to do. He might lie or cheat or say one thing to one person and the exact opposite to somebody else, but no standard of right and wrong by which he orders his life. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they had some principles that they lived by. And one of those was based on the first two of the 10 commandments that God had given to Moses on Mount Sinai. It was the idea that there is only one God and you worship only Him. You don't make any images and bow down to them and honor them as if they were gods. And that's why these three refused to obey the king. It wasn't just that they were being ornery or rebellious or anything like that. They were staying true to their principles. And we should be people of principle, but not just of any principle. We should be people who are committed to living by godly principles, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego showed us. Living by the standards and the commands that God gives us in His Word to live by. A person can have principles that he lives by, but those standards may not be in line with what God says, or at least they're not on the same level as what God commands us to do. For example, people might have political principles that they live by, and that's okay. But God's principles come first, and they take priority over those. So when our political principles and God's principles come into conflict, we need to act in accordance with what God says. And a lot of people need to think about that when it comes to considering who and what they support politically these days, whether certain candidates or certain issues. Many of us over the years, we take an issue with people who profess to be Christian, but take stances on social issues that seem to go against what the Bible teaches. But I also have a problem with professing believers who support ungodly candidates when there are better options out there. Now, people may have other types of principles that they're committed to living their lives by. Maybe principles related to their finances or their health or the environment. And that can be good and helpful and admirable. But we need to be committed first and foremost to living by God's principles. Now, I'm not someone who looks at compromise as always being a bad thing. I think there are times when compromising can be good and helpful in certain matters. There are some things we should not compromise on. And it's not just a matter of being stubborn. Some of us have to admit that we just tend to be stubborn and hard-headed about anything and everything, whether it's a little personal preference we have about something or whether it is some major principle. And so sometimes that's not a good thing. But we do need to be uncompromising and stubborn about some things, and living by God's principles is one of those. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were rightfully not willing to compromise on this issue. Now, they could have made some excuses. They could have said something like, this is a decree from the king. We had better do what the government says. Or they could have reasoned it out some other way. Said, we can bow outwardly just so that we don't get in trouble, but God will know in our hearts that we don't really mean it. No. They refused to compromise on the principles God had given them to live by. They would not bow and worship that image. And we're going to probably face temptations in our day to compromise on God's principles, maybe in order to avoid ridicule, maybe even in order to keep our jobs, or in order to be good, obedient citizens and do what the government says today. But in order to or maybe in order to avoid offending people or stirring up a controversy. But we need to be determined not to forsake God's standards of right and wrong, and not to turn away from God's commands and how He calls us to conduct ourselves. Let's be people of principle. A second takeaway from this account is the fact that we need to be people of faith. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego expressed their faith in God's ability to deliver them from this ungodly king and from his unjust death sentence. Listen again to what they said there in verse 17. They said, "Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace, and He will deliver us from your hand, O king." These men had faith. They had no doubt in what God could do. I mean, here they were standing before the man who was probably the most powerful ruler in the world at that time, or certainly at least one of them. And here they were facing sure death, about to be thrown into the middle of a fire. And yet they had faith that God was bigger and more powerful than Nebuchadnezzar, and that God was mighty enough to somehow keep them from being consumed by that hot fire. They had full confidence in God's ability and power. We need to have that kind of confidence in our day. There are a lot of powerful individuals, authorities, organizations, and movements out there today that threaten to oppose, persecute, cancel, seek to do harm to those who are steadfast in holding true to God and the truths and principles of His Word. We may find ourselves at times not only having to go against the flow of society and go against what's popular, but actually having to face the wrath of some powerful people and forces. We need to have faith that our God is bigger than our enemies. We need to have faith that our God is more powerful than whatever may get thrown at us or whatever we might get thrown into. We need to have faith that our God is able to deliver us. Think about a couple of the many examples of God's deliverance that we're told about in the Bible. Remember when David was being pursued by powerful King Saul because Saul was jealous of David and he felt threatened by his popularity, and so he was wanting to kill him. There was one occasion when Saul's army was closing in on David and his companions. David's men were on one side of a mountain and Saul's army was on the other side. David was desperately trying to get away, but Saul's army started coming around and encircling them and about to get them surrounded. But just as Saul was closing in, he heard that the Philistines had invaded the land. So he had to stop pursuing David at that moment and go take care of this other problem. Was that just a coincidence? No. No, God delivered David. In another instance, many years later, the people in Jerusalem were surrounded and being besieged by the powerful army of the Assyrians. The Assyrians had become the great empire of that day. They had defeated all the nations around Judah, and nobody had been able to withstand them. And now here they were knocking on Jerusalem's door. It looked like a pretty hopeless situation. But King Hezekiah and others prayed. And what happened? Well, one morning the Assyrians woke up to find 185,000 of their soldiers didn't wake up. They were dead. The Bible says the angel of the Lord killed them. And as a result, the remaining Assyrians packed up and left. No coincidence there. God delivered His people. Well, we serve the same God today. No matter how big your problem, how powerful your foe, no matter how hopeless it looks, be a person of faith who believes God can deliver you. He is able, if He chooses to do so. And that brings us to the next point. Trust God and be loyal to Him no matter what He chooses to do. Be a person who is loyal to God. One of the most inspiring statements made on this occasion by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was this one in verse 18. They just said, made that statement about God being able to deliver them. But then they said this, "But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up." If not, they were saying, we believe God is able to deliver us. But if he doesn't, if not, it does not change a thing. We're still firm in our resolve not to bow and worship that image. We trust God no matter whether he delivers us or not. Our loyalty to him isn't based on his doing what we want him to do. They were saying, we're not just serving him because he can deliver us. No, he's our God no matter what. We trust him no matter what. And if for some reason he chooses not to deliver us and we die in that fire, well, you can know, O king, that we still love him and serve him and are staying true to him. And that needs to be our attitude and commitment as we face the challenges and the enemies in our lives. It would be nice if God would deliver us from this problem. It would be great if he would just miraculously part the waters and open up a way through this. It would be wonderful if he would change our circumstances and suddenly calm those rough seas. It'd be amazing if he would get those who oppose us out of the way, just take them out of the picture. Or even better yet, if he would change their hearts completely so that they no longer see us as an enemy. But if he doesn't, if we have to face the fire, if we have to endure that hardship, if we have to undergo persecution, if we have to suffer and even give our lives for our faith, we still trust him. We're not going to turn our backs on him because he chose not to deliver us in the way we had hoped. We know he's able to deliver us, but we also know he's a good and a wise and a loving God whom we can trust whether he delivers us or not. Let's affirm that to be our commitment today. Whatever it is that we're going through, we're not just going to trust God to deliver us. We're going to trust him no matter whether he delivers us or not. And that brings us to the last lesson from the furnace. We can be assured that the Lord will be with us, even in the fire. I didn't mention one very significant part of this story earlier. After Nebuchadnezzar had these 3 men thrown into the furnace, he could see them there in the midst of the fire. And he could see that they were alive and they were able to walk around in the middle of those hot flames. That was amazing in itself. But he saw something else too, something even more amazing. He saw a 4th person there in the fire with them. And there was something about that 4th person that was different. The king commented that the form or appearance of this 4th person was like the Son of God. There was a divine presence there in the midst of that fire. God didn't leave Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to face it alone. He was right there with them. Whether this was an angel or some manifestation of God himself, or as many have concluded, that it was a pre-New Testament manifestation of Christ. God was there with these men as they faced the fire. And that's what we can be assured of too. Whatever furnace we get thrown into, whatever fires we have to face, we won't have to face them alone. God will be with us. Whether he is there with us to protect us and to deliver us, or whether he is there with us to comfort us and to give us the strength that we need to endure that and to go through it, or whether he's there with us to meet us and to take us home to be with him. God will be with us. There's a Facebook post circulating that I've seen several times over just the last week or two in reference to the hot weather that many of us across the country and across the world are experiencing right now. But it says this, it says, "It's so hot, I just walked outside and ran into Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." And it does kind of feel like a furnace in some places, a fiery furnace in some areas. But maybe some of us are walking through fires in a furnace of a different kind, besides the weather kind. Challenges, opposition, difficulties, whatever it is, let's see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and learn from them. Let's let them remind us to be people of principle, to not compromise when it comes to living the way God calls us to live, and to be people of faith, to know God is able to help us and deliver us, to be people who are going to keep trusting God and be loyal to Him no matter what. And let's be those who are assured that God will be with us, even right there in the middle of the furnace. He won't leave us to face it alone. Jesus is with you in the fire.